through how to register and unregister a child form. So let's dive into the details about what happens when we actually go to make a submission and we want to validate each one of those child forms, and how the validation of each one of those child forms contributes to the overall validation of the parent form. So I'm on the checkout page here, and I'm going to go ahead and submit the form to see what's going on in Redux here below. So I use this resize window action as kind of a starting place, so I can be clear about when my action started. So I go ahead and confirm my reservation. You can go back to the window resize here, and I can see that this event, validating child forms, that's the first thing that kind of sets stuff off. You can ignore that. And then I'm going out and I'm validating each one of these child forms. So let's start at this action here, validating child forms. So again, I can go to my trace function, and I want to see where that action is being dispatched. So I can see that it's getting dispatched in my checkout.js file, which might have been a good place to guess anyways if I wasn't sure. So if I go into my checkout, so I'm in pages, checkout, page types, checkout. And if I scroll down to where the actual markup is being rendered, so I see all my main components. I have my info user header, user info, room and gas, payment, items to note, and then this is here where I really care about. So this items to note contains a submit button, and when we click that, it's going to attempt to submit the form, which is this function right here, which we saw the Redux DevTools was telling us. So this is where all the magic starts. So this validate child's form, you may or may not know, but if you see this .props in action, that's probably a big clue that that function is coming from Redux. And if we just quickly verify that, we can see it is in fact coming from Redux. We are connecting it to a Redux store, and it gets imported up here in our checkout from our checkout actions. So if we go to our checkout actions, we can see that basically all that it's doing is it's dispatching this validate child forms action. It's not doing much else. So let's continue on and see what's going on in the reducer. And all that it's doing right here is changing a Boolean from false to true. And I do feel like, regrettably, this is kind of a little confusing without having somebody explicitly explain this, which is one of the reasons why I want to make these videos. Maybe there's a better way to do this, but basically what happens is when this Boolean gets set to true, this is going to alert our form.js that it should go ahead and validate all of those child forms. So without this like global event happening, the form.js is not gonna, it doesn't know whether or not it should go out and validate all those forms. But as soon as this form value gets set to true, then it's gonna know, okay, we need to go and validate each one of those forms. So inside our form.js, we are receiving those props, and if I search in here for validating child forms, again, we're receiving those props. And so it's going to say if this is a child form, because obviously we don't want to do anything if it's not a child form, and we've been told to validate those child forms, then go ahead and validate them. And basically all this is doing is it's taking advantage of the normal form validation that form.js does for a normal form, except for it's a child form. So it's doing the same stuff, like making sure that all of the elements are valid. and if one of those elements is invalid, so it's going to check the state, and there's another video on the form.js and how that works. But basically, if we've noticed that one of the elements is invalid, then we want to scroll to that element, and we want to also notify Redux that we've marked this child form as invalid. And that's going to be important later when we go through and we check to see if all of those child forms were valid or invalid. And if it's a child form and it wasn't invalid, then we can go ahead and mark it and say that it was invalid. So let's continue on and see what's going on in this update child form status function. So that, again, this .props, it's a big clue that that's coming from my actions. And if I double check, yep, it's coming from my checkout store actions. So let's go back here, update child form status. So all this is doing is it's going to take the child form name, whether or not it was valid or invalid, the form status, and then what the form values are. So basically this is the crux of how we're determining whether or not the parent form is valid or not. So we update the status of the child form, and then this is the important part. So we keep track of how many child forms have been verified against the number of total child forms, and if the total number of child forms that have been verified equal the total number of child forms, then we know that all the child forms have been checked, and we should go out and see whether or not what the results were. So again, we're inside the form.js, and just as a little recap. So if it was invalid, then we're going to say that that child form status was invalid, and if it was valid, we're going to say that it's valid. And so here's the part where we're going to go through and see if all of those child forms, what the results of all those child forms were. So come in here, check parent form validity. This is just going to go through all the child statuses, and if any one of them equals invalid, then we are going to say the entire parent form is invalid, and we're going to set that to false. And then we dispatch that action, so we can come back here and see that in our Redux action. So we start again with validating child forms, setting that global variable to be true, so that alerts the form.js that, hey, we need to check all the child forms. And it goes through and it checks all of them. It's incrementing the number of forms that have been validated. It's keeping track of the form values, which is also important because these are the form values that we're going to use to submit the checkout form. And then finally here, we've said that, okay, we needed to validate 8 child forms. We validated 8 child forms, and we can see that each one of the child form status has been marked as valid. So you can go ahead and set you can set the parent form validity as true, and you can go ahead and submit the checkout form. And the checkout form is going, again, I mentioned, but I'll just repeat, it's going to use all of these form values to aggregate into one giant form object to make the post.